Welcome to week 8 of our Shaped by God's Heart study. I'm so glad you are with us again. We are going to have a great evening of study. So we are on missional practice number 7, right? 7 already. Can you believe it? Missional practice 7 out of 9. Missional practice 7 is this. Missional churches order their actions according to purpose. So let me give you just a quick introduction to this topic. In summary, what we're going to be talking about today is that missional churches do what they do for specific reasons, and they don't do things for specific reasons. Now, if you remember, a few years back, Rick Warren wrote a couple of books that kind of took the world by storm. The Purpose-Driven Life and the Purpose-Driven Church. And he argues, he says there are many good things you can do with your life, but God's purposes are essentials that we must do. Unfortunately, it's easy to get distracted and forget what is most important. It's easy to drift away from what matters most and slowly get off course. And so the whole point is that everything we do should be driven by our purpose, by our mission as a church. However, too often we do things simply because we've always done them, or simply because somebody wants to do them, or somebody likes it, so we continue to do it. But what is the purpose of our church? What is the mission of our church? And are the things we're doing aligning with that mission? That's what we're talking about when we talk about ordering actions according to purpose. So here is what that looks like in the life of the church. The first thing is this. Missional churches know their purpose, right? This is sort of implied in the title, isn't it? You can't order your actions according to your purpose if you don't know what your purpose is, right? So missional churches know what their purpose is. They know the task that God has set in front of them. Now, churches generally operate out of two areas, their purpose and the culture in the church. Right? Because we kind of have our own culture that happens. It comes up as we work together, as we minister together, as we do life together. This sort of culture of how we do things around here is created. And so the purpose of the church is the strategic goal of the church. Right? So for example, in the United Methodist Church, our goal, our mission, our purpose is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's the purpose, okay? The culture is the environment in which that goal is pursued, okay? It's how we do it. How do we do things? Now, the problem is, too often, the purpose and the culture do not line up, right? So, in other words, what we say we do and what we actually do are often very different. Very different, okay? We say that our purpose is to make disciples, but then the things we focus on in the church, the things we spend money on in the church, don't actually lead to making disciples. And so the culture and the purpose are different, right? The culture in a lot of churches is fellowship, right? The culture is we want to spend time with people. It's not about the actual purpose of the church, right? So there's a lot that goes into this, purpose and culture. Now, if the culture, this is one of my favorite quotes in the book, okay, so listen carefully. If the culture does not embrace values that result in accomplishing the goal or the purpose, either the culture must be changed, a uniquely challenging prospect, or the purpose must be restated. It is easier to change the purpose statement than to change culture to an environment in which a new purpose can be accomplished. Okay, did you catch that? So when culture and purpose don't line up, you have a problem. Unfortunately, most places, changing culture is hard and it takes time. That's not to say you shouldn't, right? Because there are a lot of unhealthy cultures in the church. Okay? A lot. There are a lot of unhealthy cultures that need shifted. However, what you need to do is find the middle ground between where your culture is at, where your purpose is, right? And what is our actual purpose as a church? What are we going to accomplish? And so, missional churches know their purpose, and they essentially plaster it everywhere, right? It's on the walls, it's in the bulletins, it's on their website. Every member can recite it because it's the goal the church is out to accomplish, the thing that we want to do as a church body. It is embraced as the sole purpose for existence for the congregation, right? This is why my church exists. And Peter Drucker, who is a specialist in business and in mission statements specifically, he says this: a mission statement has to be operational. Otherwise, it's just a statement. A mission statement has to focus on what the institution really tries to do and then do it, so that everybody in the organization can say, this is my contribution to the goal. Right? In other words, a mission statement is not some like big, huge thing that people can't point to and be like, I helped do that. Right? A mission statement has to be actionable enough so that when I do ministry, I can say, here was my contribution to making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Right? We have to be able to actually put word to it. Okay? And put feet to our mission statement, to our purpose. So, missional churches know their purpose. And then once they know their purpose, missional churches check that their actions are based upon their purpose. Now, this is their strategic piece to the mission statement. All right? It's checking to make sure the things we're doing are actually fulfilling our purpose. Okay? He says, anytime performance does not enhance the accomplishment of the purpose, then that performance is the actual purpose. Right? So, for example, if your church is doing a ministry, let's say that it is feeding people on Wednesday nights, right? So your church is doing this meal on Wednesday nights, and your church has been doing this thing for forever, right? But nobody's gotten saved, nobody's come to church, there's no discipling happening, right? For the most part, if you actually sat down and looked at the meal, what it actually was a chance for your church family to just sit down together, laugh, and have a great time. But this community meal, which originally was purposed, it was originally purposed to reach the community, now no longer reaches the community. So we are checking to make sure that the thing we're doing is not just the reason we exist, right? Why are we doing Wednesday nights? Well, just to do Wednesday nights, because we've always done it, right? No. Okay, see, so in other words, we can't just do things simply because we've always done them, or simply because it's what we know to do, right? Because what we do is we begin to exist simply to do that thing, right? How many times have churches, right? Hear me out. How many times have churches gone so far from their purpose that if we were actually looking at the church, the reason they exist is to put on Sunday morning worship, right? Because there's no ministry happening outside of Sunday mornings, right? Sunday morning is everything that we do. All of our eggs are on Sunday mornings, right? Everything is in that basket. We exist simply to have a Sunday morning church service. We don't exist to make disciples. We don't exist to change the world. We don't exist for whatever the purpose of the church is. The purpose of the church has become to put on Sunday worship. You see what I'm saying? So this is why it is so important for your church to know its purpose so that we can then be productive in the things we're trying to do. So, how do we do this? How do we check that our actions and purposes are lining up? Well, there's a few things that the book suggests you can look at to see what the actual purpose of your church is. Now, the first is your church calendar. We're asking things like, are the things we're scheduling actually accomplishing our purpose, or is the calendar full of activity with very little fruit? Right? How do the activities in our calendar fulfill our purpose? Now, it's easy at this phase to just justify everything, right? Everything has a justification on why we should keep it. Everything can be justified. But what we're looking for here really is proportions. So, for example, most churches are predominantly scheduling inward activities that benefit their members or specifically bring community into the building, right? It's all about how many people can we get here? How many butts in the seats? But what we want is actually a balance of our ministry, right? We need inside ministries, we need outside ministries, right? We need ministries that develop disciples within people inside, and we need ministries that go out into the streets and make disciples of people in our community. Okay, we need both and everything. It's a balance thing, right? Too many churches are solely focused inward. Okay, all of our ministries are about the people who are already here, and there's nothing, or at least very little, right, about going out and reaching people in our community. So the other thing to think about when you think about calendaring events is the participation level in events, right? So for example, a prayer meeting might look good on the calendar, but if you only have 3 people who are showing up in a church with 3,000, it's clearly not a priority, right? It looks good because we're like, oh, we have a prayer meeting, right? then only 3 people are showing up. That's not to say, and I want to put this caveat in there, it's not to say that numbers should dictate what you do, right? There are very important ministries that happen with just a few people in them. What I'm saying is you got to find new and unique ways to reach people. If you want to make prayer a priority, find ways that are going to get people tagged in, right? Look at participation levels, okay? Just because we do it doesn't mean it's considered important by our people. All right, so we look at the calendar, we look at participation level of the things on the calendar, but the other thing that he recommends you look at is your budget, okay? Now, usually at most churches, a majority of the budget is spent on staff, buildings, utilities, maintenance, a little bit on some ministry, and a little bit on missions and evangelism. All right. The problem with this is most of your church purpose statements, now I'm really hoping this is true for most of you, okay, but the purpose statement at your church probably doesn't have anything to do with your building, right? It probably has nothing to do with your building, right? Does the church purpose say anything about a building? Bluntly, no. And yet, we have this massive piece of our budgets in churches that are taken up by building maintenance, right? Partly because the church in America has experienced many years of favor, so a lot of our church buildings are older, and old buildings require a ton of maintenance. The problem is, buildings are not our purpose, right? We do not exist to be the local historical society. We do not exist to be the building preservation team, right? That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to make disciples. And sometimes those costs can hinder ministry. And a lot of times they do. Buildings are expensive. Even new buildings are expensive. So this is why some churches have actually moved to house church models to avoid this expense, right? So these churches meet in homes in these little cell groups, essentially, in homes, 10 to 15, 20 people in a house. And they kind of have teamed up with a bunch of other home cell groups, right? Because they don't have building expenses, these churches are giving upwards of 80% of their budget to mission and evangelism. 80%, right? Imagine how much we could free up a budget at our church to be able to give 80% of it away. How awesome is that, right? But it requires us to sacrifice some of the things that we've always clung to, right? Because some of the things we cling to are expensive. And so when you look at your budget, right, because we've mentioned buildings because that's where the book talks. The book focuses in on buildings, but there are lots of other things in the church that we spend money on that we shouldn't be, right? There are things we're budgeting that we should be budgeting better, right? Now, your church, every church tries to budget well. It's not like you have a problem with your finance team or something, right? The problem is simply the priorities of the people in the church, right? Because your budgets come out of the priorities that are within our hearts, okay? So our problem is, where is our priority as a church? Are we actually focused on the purpose of our church or not? That's what we're talking about. Okay, so missional churches make tough decisions on their calendar, on their finances, on their buildings, right? Missional churches make these tough decisions because they want to fulfill the purpose God has given them, right? They want to be able to say, we have done the work God has given us. And so they can properly invest in the mission of God, the Missio Dei from week 1. We're investing in people, right? Which is why staffing costs tend to be a little high, because we're investing in people. We're investing in the gifts that God has given to our church, right? Our staff people are very gifted, and they are talented, and God is blessing them with so much. And so we're investing in them, right? We're investing in the staff. We're investing in our people, in our volunteers. We're investing in our ministry, the work God has given us, right? We're investing in the right places. So how do we do this? Like, if we're going to look at our stuff and be like, okay, how do we refocus on our purpose? There's really two additional ways that we can do this. The first is that missional churches let go of what does not serve their purpose. Okay, they let go of things that don't serve the purpose. Now, churches tend to be a lot better at starting things than at quitting the old things. All right, even things that are no longer fruitful. All right, we're really good at, well, let's add this and add this and add this. We're really bad at saying, well, that's really not fruitful. We should ditch that. It just becomes part of the way that we do things. And there's the problem that there are some people who will always like the ministry. No matter how unfruitful it is, no matter how costly it is, there are people who like what we have and what we're offering. And unfortunately, those people are often the loudest people at the church. So to avoid conflict, we just keep doing things that we shouldn't be doing anymore. right? Because we don't want to have conflict within the church. We think that conflict is bad, right? Here's the problem. Conflict can be good. Conflict is what comes when you try to go forward and to go and fulfill your purpose. So we avoid the conflict by simply not talking about it, by simply leaving the ministry exactly the same way it is without making any changes to keep everybody happy. The problem is not everybody's happy. The main problem is, in this thinking, is that our purpose is not to keep the people in the church happy. Our purpose is not to keep butts in the seats. Our purpose is to reach the community outside these windows. Our purpose is to reach the world for Jesus, to go and preach the gospel to all nations, right? Our purpose is so much bigger than just let's not make people angry. And so Peter Drucker weighs in here again, and he offers that change means an organized abandonment, right? Because change requires us to give things up, which is what we're talking about here. He talks about abandoning yesterday to free up resources to commit to the work of today and tomorrow. Right? It's about recognizing that the church doesn't live in yesterday. The church has life ahead of it, right? Our best life was not behind us. Our best life is still ahead of us. And so for Drucker, he says that the church is not your local historical society. Its job is not to preserve history. The church's job is to fulfill the mission that God has given us, right? The Great Commission, the specific purpose God has given our church. And to do that, we have to stop doing things that don't fulfill our purpose or that hinder us simply by the maintenance required to upkeep it, right? So, for example, your church may do a ministry, and I'm sure you can think of the one. It requires tons of people, right? And I think of this church, I forget which one it was, but I think of this church in this moment that had done the Upwards basketball program, and they felt like it required so many volunteers and so much work. And do you know how many people they had come to Jesus from that program in 10 years? None. None. And so the church cut it, right? Because they're like, look, this is not producing the disciples we want to produce. Right? We're trying to make disciples. This program isn't doing it. We're using a lot of volunteer man hours, right? It's the same reason that churches are moving to single board. So they're like, look, our people are spending hours in committee meetings. It's time to free them up to actually fulfill our purpose, because our purpose is not to spend hours in committees. So, missional churches know that they exist for those outside their ranks to reach the lost, right? They have a specific purpose they are trying to fulfill. And so they stop doing things that don't serve the purpose. Okay. Now, there's a great example in the book of Mosaic Church in Los Angeles. And they talked about how they get a lot of transfer Christians, because they're kind of a big church, kind of a popular church. They get a lot of Christians who are transferring in. And they said they constantly are asked to play hymns in their services. And they will always, politely and respectfully, say no. Why? Because their purpose is specifically to reach the people in the streets, people who do not get the church lingo of the hymns. They offer to help people find a church that does play hymns, as there are plenty in the area, right? This is a church that knows what they are about. They know the purpose God has given them, and they are not willing to sacrifice it to simply appease the people in the pews, right? They are trying to fulfill the purpose of God for their church. Now, it's not about hymns, right? This is just one example. It's not about hymns, it's about purpose, right? Why are we doing the things we're doing? This is why I do not understand why people feel it necessary to bash on one worship style or another, right? In fact, it actually makes me a little bit upset if you can't tell from this video, right? Look, you can like hymns and not hate on contemporary worship. You can like contemporary worship and not hate on hymns, right? It is all the same to God, right? It is sweet music of praise in his ears. Worship is not about you, okay? Worship is not about you. This is why churches make the decisions they do, because they want to fulfill their purpose. And if our purpose is to reach people who don't come to church, reach people who don't know Jesus, reach people who have never set foot in church in their lives, they are not going to understand much of the lingo in the hymns. I barely understand it. So, this is why churches stop doing things that don't make sense, that don't fulfill their purpose, okay? This is why they do that, okay? Because this frees up our time and makes us laser focused on the thing that God wants us to do. Now, it's not just that they stop doing things. Missional churches do only what serves the purpose, right? So they stop doing things that don't serve it, and they only do the things that do serve the purpose, right? It's the flip side to our last point. In other words, are we spending our time on things that fulfill our purpose? Not just about being busy. Now, he offers this great fill-in-the-blank poem for you. So let me read it off for you, right? Mary had a little lamb. It could have been a sheep. It joined the local United Methodist Church and died from lack of sleep. Come on. We all know it's true, right? We get busy, right? So the problem is we get busy with stuff that doesn't make sense. So what do? Well, we do things that are strategic and excellent to better use our members' time, right? We don't confuse activity with accomplishment. And so the church has to determine its response to this barrage of opportunities, right? Because if you've never been in ministry, let me tell you, there are new opportunities to do in ministry in your community every single day that come into my email inbox, okay? There are people who want to help with this and help us with that and help with that. And there are so many ways we can plug in. We've got to figure out, what is it God has called us to do? What is our purpose? What serves our purpose and what does not? Now, Jimmy Cyber, who's a pastor of a larger church, he said he turns down 90% of speaking engagements elsewhere outside of his church because, as he puts it, it requires 100% of your life to see a healthy church come to pass, right? It's the focus on the things we should do as a church, right? Where are we sowing our life, all right? So, as an example, making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's the purpose of the United Methodist Church. So one way that churches have been doing this is by crafting discipleship pathways. In other words, your church's plan on how it's going to make disciples, a purposeful plan. Because most churches say they make disciples, but when you ask them how they're going to do it, they're just going to throw random stuff out there. Here's the things we're already doing, right? There's not an actual plan. So discipleship pathway offers you, okay, you're at this stage of your journey, here's where we want you to plug in. You're at this stage, great. Here's a great place for you to plug in. And we actually know where to send people because we've planned it out. All right? So that's an example of doing things that serve our purpose. And spoiler alert, if you're watching from my church, we're going to be making a discipleship pathway next year. We're getting on it, okay? Because we and I have a plan for you, right? God has a plan for your life, and we are going to help you find it. So, as a recap, okay, missional churches know their purpose, assess everything they have and do based on that purpose. They stop doing things that don't serve the purpose, and they only do things that do serve the purpose. All right, so let me give you a few questions to consider this week. Number one, what is the mission of your church? Is it actionable and measurable? In other words, can you know that you are completing the mission of your church? The change leader puts every product, every service, every process, every market, every distribution channel, every customer and end use on trial for its life. And it does so on a regular schedule. The question has to be asked, and asked seriously, if we did not do this already, would we, knowing what we know now, go into it? Okay, so what might change if your church introduced this philosophy? Number three, consider the ministries that you are active in. Do they lead to a direct fulfillment of the mission of your church? And if not, how could they? So, be thinking about the purpose of your church this week and how we're fulfilling it. Things we can do, things we shouldn't do, changes that need to be made so that we can better fulfill our purpose as a church. I'll see you next week. Love you.